Hello friends, today we'll talk about the First World War and in the earlier discussion on the First World War we talked about the causes of the war, that how the different causes of the war they were responsible for the First World War, and how it turned out to be a great war among various European nations. And when we tend to understand the First World War, we also see that all these factors which were responsible for the war, whether in the framework of the idea of the secret alliances or the economic imperialism or the kind of jingoistic feeling which was there among the various nations, as well as the people, those who were inhabiting these nations, and some kind of a war between the press as well. So all these factors, they combined together, and they could be seen in the framework of the short-term causes as well as the long-term causes, which were being discussed in our first lecture on the First World War. And thereafter we also talked about the Treaty of Versailles and the various provisions which were there in the Treaty of Versailles. And we also find that how the Treaty of Versailles, it was being criticized, and that how Germans, they were not being consulted at all, and it was seen as a treaty which was a dictated kind of a treaty, and the German representatives, they signed the treaty at the point of bayonet. So they were being threatened with the invasion of their country if they did not sign. And scholars like E.H. Carr, they have argued that the Treaty of Versailles, the element of dictation was more apparent than in any previous peace treaty of modern times. So we find that how Treaty of Versailles also reflected in a way the spirit of revenge, that how to the victors belong all the spoils, and the allies, they were the victors. And the way war indemnity which was being imposed on Germany in the form of the reparations, and the way demilitarization and the disarmament clauses, they were being imposed, and the most importantly the war guilt clause and the forcible annexation of its territories, all of them, they reflected the spirit of revenge. And the war guilt clause talked about that how Germany was solely responsible for the First World War. So these kinds of the way Germany was being handled by the victorious nations, it reflected that there was some sort of a spirit of revenge in the way they were trying to function at that point of time. And the kind of reparations which were being asked from Germany, they were astronomical in nature. And at that point of time, because of the war, Germany herself was in tatters, and the demand for the reparations was $6,600 million, which was a huge figure even in those times. And allies, they decreased the amount to $2,000 million in the Young Plan in 1929. And we find that Germany did not pay the initial amount of $6,600 million to the victorious nations, and even that was not possible at that point of time, considering the situation of Germany. And we find that the people, those who were associated in terms of the ideas of economics, and J.M. Keynes, who was an economic advisor to the British delegation at the peace conference, they suggested same figure during the deliberations for treaty. And we finally find that Germany only paid $1,000 million as a reparation, and stopped the payments after that. And we also find that how the war guilt clause, it was not to be seen as realistic in nature, and to make or insist that Germans, they had to accept the war guilt clause itself was not a right thing to do. And David Thompson, he argues that a sense of moral responsibility could not be created by including a statement of it in a document which German representatives were compelled to sign. So to force someone to have this kind of a sense of moral responsibility was not a right thing to do, and it was criticized by these scholars like David Thompson. And it at the same time was also not realistic in that sense that one cannot force a nation to hold or to be held responsible for any kind of an act in which various nations they were also being involved. We also find that how the negation of the principle of self-determination and nationalism also takes place, and it gave the right to people of the same nationality and culture to create independent and separate states. We also see that in the case of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, these principles were followed, but a large number of Germans of Posen and the Western Prussia, they were left in Poland. In Dalmatia, many Slavs, they were left under Italy. And thirdly, many Germans, they were left under Slavs in Bohemia. So we find that this kind of a negation of the principle of self-determination and nationalism could also be seen. And these few examples, as you can see on the screen, they also suggest that these kind of developments they took place. We also find that how allies they prohibited the union of Austria and Germany, and at the same time the creation of minority problem plagued the European politics and caused trouble in future. We also find that the kind of development of democracy also took place, and the three autocratic dynasties in Europe, Habsburg in Austria-Hungary, Hohenzollern in Germany, and Romanov in Russia, they fell, and their place was taken up by constitutional governments. And the republican form of government was established in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and in Turkey, where caliphate and sultanate they were overthrown. So when we try to see the kind of an impact which the First World War created, where we find that how the League of Nations was created, and the horrors of the war, the way so many people they got killed, the destruction of so much property in different regions of the world, and how so many people got mutilated, we find that it in a way motivated the leaders to evolve certain institutions to prevent the war and to promote the international peace and cooperation. So because of which we find that international organization like League of Nations was established. We also find that how some kind of a thrust to the scientific progress was made during this time, as during the war various inventions and innovations took place to improve the military weapons and the equipments, and these scientific inventions later contributed to the greater agricultural and industrial progress. We also see in terms of the kind of consequences how the progress of the women folk also takes place. We find that so many men they died in the wars, where the women they had to join factories as labor, and over a period of time they became the regular labor force. And in many countries, women they demanded and received the right to engage in a number of occupations and to engage in politics. And around 65 million people they participated in the war, and around 6,000 people they were being killed each day for more than 1500 days. So that was the kind of devastation which was being caused by the war, where so many people died, and so many people they became maimed as well. So this kind of a loss in terms of life as well as property and money, we find that Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, it calculated war's actual cost as $338 billion. So this was a huge amount if you see the actual cost of the war. And if you see the normal life of the inhabitants after the war, we find that soldiers with mutilated limbs and other deformity, they were a common sight in European cities, towns and villages at that point of time. So this kind of a destruction of the life and property because of the First World War tried to teach some kind of a lesson to the people, those who got engaged in the war. But definitely when we see that how the lessons they were not being learnt, and despite witnessing such kind of a loss of life and property, Second World War was also also took place, and similar kind of loss of life, property could also be seen in the Second World War as well. When we tend to understand the First World War in a framework of the kind of consequences or the impact which it was able to create, we find that so many widows and the spinsters, their numbers, they increased. And if you see the war cemeteries, they stretched across northern France and Belgium. And we also find that the pensions for the families of the dead soldiers and the invalids, they strained the resources of the various countries or the budgets of the various countries. And the rising inflation after the war and the unemployment which was there in the different nations of the world, it made the lives of the common masses miserable at that point of time. So we also see, apart from the kind of impact or the consequences of the First World War in terms of the economic hardships, in terms of the kind of changes which came in the lives of women in those times, we also find that some kind of rise of the dictatorships could also be attributed to the First World War, in a sense that for example, Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy, they were seen to be the new dictatorships in Europe, and both Hitler as well as Mussolini, both of them, they realized that how Germany as well as Italy, both of them, they were dissatisfied with the war. The kind of ambitions which Italy had, they could not be fulfilled, and Germany definitely was a defeated country, and the way Treaty of Versailles was imposed on Germany was some sort of an insult to the German pride. And we find that the rise of Hitler in Germany and the rise of Mussolini in Italy, both of them after the First World War, are also seen as an impact or the kind of consequence of the Treaty of Versailles. We also find that these kinds of dictatorships, the way they played, how they tried to muzzle the free press, they restricted the free speech and introduced the one party or one man rule. And we also see that scholars, they have tried to in a way understand the kind of participation of women at that point of time. For example, Arthur Marwick, by 1918, he says that the 37.6% of the workforce in Krupp armament company in Germany was female. In Britain, the members of the women workers, it rose sharply in the public transport, bus conductors, banking and commerce. So women, they were in a way going to the different sectors of the economy, they were working in the different sectors of the economy, and as they did not have much option as well, because so many men they had died during the war, and there was shortage of able men to work in these factories. And when we try to see it in the economic framework, then we find that because of the rising inflation in Britain, if we tend to understand the situation, a pound sterling bought in 1919 about one third of what it had bought in 1914, and in Germany, mark lost its value at the end of 1923. So we find that this kind of an inflationary situation could be seen in many countries of Europe at that point of time. And the prices, they also increased in France, they nearly doubled during the war. And if you see the people, those who were the sufferers of this rising inflation were the people of the middle class, those who had fixed incomes. And when the prices of the products, whether they doubled or they tripled, then they had the same amount of money, the amount of money did not change. So it became some sort of a serious problem for the people of the middle class. And we also see that how Germany, it was being reduced in terms of its air force, navy and the German army. it became some sort of a pale shadow of its former self. And Germans, they felt a lot of heartburn when none of the Allied powers, they exhibited desire to disarm. Even though 14 points of 14 points of Wilson, they mentioned about the all-round reduction of the armaments, but the all-round reduction of the armaments did not take place. It only took place in the context of Germany, not in the context of other nations. So when we tend to understand that how the critics, they have pointed out the issue of the seeds of the Second World War, that they lay in the Treaty of Versailles, and the way Germany was being mistreated, that how the treaty was seen to be as a harsh treaty, and the behavior of the Allies, particularly France, they destroyed all the chances of republican regime in Germany. And it also in a way facilitated the rise of Hitler to power, who used the Treaty of Versailles to arouse the passion and support in his own favor. There are others, those who suggest that the period between the two world wars, it can be seen in terms of the infringement of the Treaty of Versailles. And in 1926, treaty was in a way amended to allow Germany to become the member of the League of Nations, and Germany was in a way incorporated as a member of the League of Nations. We also see that in 1935 Germany violated the provisions which were relating to the military, navy and the air force, and the Germany also considerably reduced the reparations which were to be paid by it in due course of time. So even when the kind of clauses which were being imposed on Germany through the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler got this kind of an opportunity to violate the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, and he was also able to mobilize the opinion, the public opinion, where he was able to convince the masses, which were in a way already aware that how Treaty of Versailles not only gave them an economic setback, but at the same time it also proved to be humiliating to them. It was some sort of an insult to their honor, and but at the same time we also find that when we try to analyze the Treaty of Versailles, there are peoples, those who defend the Treaty of Versailles, there are peoples those who reject or criticize the Treaty of Versailles. We also have to take into account the kind of conflicting difficulties and the complicated problems facing the peacemakers in Paris. And they also had before them the treaties of Brest-Litovsk and Bucharest, which were imposed by Germany herself on the defeated powers, and the peacemakers in Paris, they were undoubtedly affected by the contents of these treaties as well. And the others, those who see that whether the kind of claims which were made by Clemenceau, that the conference called in all parties interested and all those who had anything to say, they were being heard in the Treaty of Versailles. But when we try to understand the Treaty of Versailles, we find that it was an imposed treaty, and Germans, they were being excluded at the drafting stage. Their objections, they were being rebutted, and the threat of invasion was given to them if they did not sign the papers. So this provided that the treaty, this kind of Treaty of Versailles was not framed at a conference, rather it appeared to be a tribunal, as some of the scholars they have talked about. And we also see that after the Treaty of Versailles was being imposed on Germany after the First World War, there were a lot of changes in the map of Europe, and at the same time we also find not only there were changes in the map of Europe, but a lot of changes came in terms of the power dynamics as well. And we find that the shift of the center of gravity in terms of the political, economic and military from Europe to America takes place. And before the war, European powers, they had maneuvered for advantage in Europe, and but we find after the First World War, the might of the two non-European powers, USA and Japan, it correspondingly increased, and the way US engaged itself in the war, where it provided not only the food and money to the allied nations, but it also provided them arms and ammunition so that they can defend themselves. And we find that how allies, they became heavily indebted to USA, largely because of the loans which were being made by the Washington government. And we find that how USA was transformed into a creditor country. So we find that how this kind of a change in the balance of power takes place, where USA becomes more dominant after the First World War. And we also find that how new states, they were also born out of the old Russian Empire. Finland, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, they were being created. And we also find that out of the dismemberment of the Austria-Hungary arose independent nations like Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. Countries like China, Turkey, Egypt and Ireland, they also felt the impact of nationalism. So we also see that how the First World War, the way it was being fought in the different theaters of war, and how during the course of the war so many people, they lost their lives, their livelihood, and at the same time so much of loss of property also takes place. And in a way we find that the First World War or the Great War, it contributed in that sense that the people, they should take some kind of a lesson that they should not enter into a war in the future. But despite that, no lessons they were being learned during this time, as we can see that how Hitler as well as Mussolini, both of them, they became dictators in Germany and Italy. And the expansionist policies which were being followed by Hitler during this time resulted in the Second World War. And we also have to see the politics of the 1930s, where Britain and France, they appear to be more appeasing in the context of Germany, where they were trying to appease Germany. And Germany felt that it will be able to sustain even the attack on Poland. And in a way, some of the scholars, they have also argued that it was some sort of a miscalculation by Germany, and the earlier annexations which he had made, and how they were being in a way ignored by both Britain and France. So when we tend to understand the kind of contribution which was even made by the Indians, that how so many Indian soldiers, they fought in the First World War, and the social and the cultural aspects of their experiences of fighting on the foreign soil, how these people, so many of them, they lost their lives in the deadly battles which they were fighting in a foreign terrain, and their contributions which have largely remained unrecognized in the sense that not much was written on them. And we find that only some of the scholars in the later times, as I told you, Ashutosh Kumar and Markowitz, both of them, they have talked about the contribution of the Indian soldiers in the First World War, and how they fought in the various regions where the First World War was being fought. The way they were being provided the material incentives, or through coercion and training, which in a way how people, those who were the peasants, they were being converted into the soldiers and combatants. And the encounters of the travelling engine soldiers with the other societies as well, and the contribution of the returned soldiers in the Indian society, when these soldiers, when they came back to their own land, and how these soldiers, they used their experiences in the war which they fought in other regions of the world. So when we try to understand the First World War in its totality, whether in the framework of the causes of the war, whether in the framework of the kind of treaty of Versailles which was being imposed on Germany, the reaction of Germany to this treaty, where in 1930s it in a way rejected the kind of provisions which were there in the treaty, and the rise of Hitler in that sense, that how Hitler he was able to establish himself by criticizing the Treaty of Versailles, where he talks about that how Germany it had to become great again, and the ideas of the Aryan race which were being propagated, the idea of a totalitarian regime where Führer or Hitler became more important. So the Treaty of Versailles, which was being imposed on Germany, in a way created this kind of a path for a dictator like Hitler, where he was able to use the kind of clauses which were available in the Treaty of Versailles, whether in the framework of the military clauses, whether in the framework of the political clauses, legal clauses. All of them, they were being in a way utilized by Hitler so as to follow a kind of a policy which were being reflected in the books which were written by him, Mein Kampf as well as Jutes Buck. Jutes Buck was unpublished, which was written in 1928, and Mein Kampf, which is the autobiography of Hitler. So when we tend to understand the First World War, we have to see that how the First World War also in a way not only led to the loss of life and property during this time. It was not only acknowledged as a great war, but we also find that the lessons, they were not being learnt when the Second World War could also be seen, which began in 1939. So with this, I'd like to end the discussion. Thank you very much.